Hi, Lagim fam. Before I start the show, I want to introduce you to my friends Abby and Alan from the Lunatics Radio Hour podcast. Now, you know I love the horror genre as much as I love my true crime, and hosts Abby and Alan have the perfect podcast for the horror fans and even non-fans out there. The Lunatic Radio Hour podcast covers not only all things horror, but also the history behind it. Abby and Alan combine their interests in history and folklore, doing deep dives into things like the history of cannibalism or the history of clowns. Learn about the history of horror tropes or of popular paranormal cases, as well as short horror stories submitted by their listeners. Find and listen to the Lunatics Radio Hour podcast, available on all podcasting platforms right now. Okay, now on to the show. If you have listened to enough true crime podcast episodes or watched true crime documentaries, you begin to see a pattern. Sure, there are some cases that can completely come from the left field and surprise you, but the majority of cases show commonalities in human behavior. Well, at least the worst parts of it. We begin, for example, to understand that the first 24 hours after a child abduction are the most crucial ones, and most of the time, if the child is not found by then, the likelihood that the police will find them alive becomes less and less as time goes by. We also gradually learn that stranger rape is more uncommon than one might think, and investigators always look for their suspects amongst the victims' friend circles and/or family. And then we have the husband and wife cases. We might think we know how a case pans out in the end, but a lot of the time as listeners or viewers, we are being thrown a curveball. We heard about the alibi put forward by Michael Peterson in the documentary The Staircase as to how his wife Kathleen died. We even saw a dramatization of the two possibilities Kathleen Peterson may have died in that new drama series on HBO Max, and we feel that maybe things did not happen the way the prosecution said it happened. I feel very uneasy about such cases because despite the jokes about how it is always the husband or the boyfriend, the four walls of a couple's home are the only witnesses. Oh, if those walls could only speak. Today's case is just that type of case where, at first glance, things made sense quickly. However, when one dared to scratch the surface, people saw the complexities of this relationship that those closest to the couple did not even see or experience. This is the case of Caroline Crouch. Mabuhay Lagim fam, welcome to episode 11 of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. I am your host, Christine Abrigana. Today's episode is a re-recording of a case I covered a year ago on my old Patreon account. Those who were patrons back then may remember this case. There's been some movement in this case, so I thought it would be good to take a look again and add any updates I could find following the recent developments. I am unofficially on podcast break to just relax a bit and to allow myself to enjoy the summer as I travel back to Germany for a bit. So please expect episode 12 to be released on the 15th of July. After that, there will be 3 more episodes before season 3 ends, and I may have a major or maybe a minor announcement by then. I am not sure yet. Either way, I will let you know. Having said all that, please consider becoming a patron by subscribing to my new Patreon account, where for $2 a month, you can get ad-free early access to my regular episodes. This kind of support really helps me with the production of this podcast, especially because, as you know, I am an independent podcaster. Alternatively, you can make a one-off donation, or many if you want, to buymecoffee.com. All the links are in the show notes. Furthermore, do not forget to not only follow me on all my socials, but consider using my affiliate links as well. Again, those links are in the show notes. As always, please note that details in this episode can be triggering for some people. So please take care of yourselves whilst listening. As you know, Lagim fam, I mostly cover cases that took place in the motherland, but from time to time, I do find it important to dip into cases involving our kababayans, our fellow Filipinos who are living abroad. I have a few more cases of this nature on my list, but I wanted to feature today's case in this season as there has been some recent development. So today, I will take you with me to Greece. The Hellenic Republic, better known as Greece, is considered the cradle of Western civilization, the birthplace of democracy, the Olympic Games, and even the concept of trial by jury, amongst many, many other things. Although it is a great shame of mine that I've not yet dared to step foot in this southern European country, I have made a promise that I will seek to rectify this as soon as possible. Greece's capital is Athens, a city of around 4 million people and the largest city in the country. The capital is a buzzing place where the modern collides with the ancient. Athens has always been a tourist attraction even in antiquity. It hosts over 100 theatrical stages, music venues, restaurants, and tavernas, where locals and tourists rub shoulders after a day of exploring the ruins of ancient Greece. But far away from the city center and tourist spots lie a quiet suburb called Glicanera in the northeastern part of Athens. Glicanera means sweet waters. One cannot find much online about this suburb, which just shows you how not of a touristic place this is, but rather a nice residential area far away from the beating heart of the capital. But Glicanera would soon become the center of Greece for at least a few weeks in 2021, when in May of the same year, just after the world entered year 2 of the COVID pandemic, international and national media honed in on the small suburb following news of a horrible murder that had the public on the edge of their seats. At around 6 in the morning on the 11th of May 2021, Greek pilot Babis Anagnostopoulos alerted the police and reported a burglary that had taken place at his home. He told the police that money and jewelry were taken. Worst of all, according to Babis, the burglars had brutally murdered his wife Carolyn by strangling her in front of their 11-month-old baby named Lydia. As the day progressed, not only would the police occupy most of the neighborhood where Babis and his family lived, but the press would also soon descend upon Glicanera. Speaking to the Greek press outside the couple's home, Babis Anagnostopoulos said, quote, "I wish no one ever goes through what we went through last night. It was a nightmare. We begged the thieves not to harm us. We told them where the money was and asked them to leave us alone." End of quote. So what exactly happened according to Babis? According to him, the family was fast asleep when burglars broke into their home. Carolyn and Lydia were both asleep upstairs whilst Babis slept downstairs. The family was easily overpowered, and Babis stated that before he knew it, he and Carolyn were tied up. One of the burglars had allegedly held a gun to baby Lydia's head, perhaps in an effort to discourage the couple from fighting back. Bobbies then recounted how the burglars demanded to know where the couple hid their money and did so in broken Greek, giving the couple, or at least Bobbies, the impression that they were being burgled by non-Greek men. Bobbies would later explain that indeed the couple had a large amount of cash in their property as they'd recently bought some land and needed to pay the builders. Bobbies added that eventually he told the burglars where the money was. It was hidden in a Monopoly box. Apparently, when the burglars were done stealing that money, they demanded more from Bobbies. When he could not provide them with what they asked for, he recounted how he heard Carolyn screaming from upstairs. This part is slightly confusing for me, as it would seem that Caroline, who was originally upstairs according to Bobbies, was either tied up there and was there the whole time with her baby, or the whole family was brought downstairs. The couple was then tied up and baby Lydia threatened with a gun, after which Caroline was dragged upstairs, where she was then hurt by the burglars. It is a bit confusing, and I could not find any more clarification in the news outlets that I have used in the research of this episode. Bobbies then continued and stated that he could hear that baby Lydia was crying, as well as Carolyn. He then said that other people were also looking through their home to find more money and jewelry, whilst the others continued to threaten him. The burglars allegedly said that if he did not tell them where the money was, they would kill the baby. Knowing that there was no more money on the property, he told them just that, but this further angered the men. Bobbies recounted how he at some point noticed that Carolyn had fallen silent. She was not screaming anymore. When he later recounted this to the police, he presumed that this was the point when the burglars had strangled his wife to death. He would also add that when the burglars eventually left, he also found the family dog Roxy choked to death, hanging from the home's staircase, still on the leash. Judging from Bobbies' account, it seemed to have been a truly grisly and upsetting scene. Now, it was not clear in the early days of the investigation whether the burglars managed to find any more money or valuables, but we do know that at 6 a.m., Bobbies made the call to the police to report what had happened to his family after he managed to apparently free himself from being tied up. Both him and baby Lydia were then checked over in the hospital after the police and emergency medical services had arrived at their family home. Soon after, both Bobbies and baby Lydia were safeguarded, and after Carolyn was discovered murdered in her home, the police opened an investigation into the burglary gone very wrong. The Greek police initially theorized how it was likely that the burglars kept the married couple under surveillance for some time before invading the home. The police also explained that CCTV footage from cameras around the family home would be reviewed to help with the identification of the perpetrators. Later on, it was also announced that a €250,000 reward was being offered to anyone who had information about the burglars. Bobbies Anagnostopoulos said the men had spoken a foreign language amongst themselves when they were not trying to speak Greek. He also said that he was unable to identify what the foreign language was. This was the only clue the police and the public had at that moment. And what a clue it was. I would argue that this clue propelled this crime into the national consciousness of Greece for reasons I will explain in a few seconds. Having heard that these burglars had apparently spoken a foreign language and also broken Greek, some parts of the Greek public latched on to the possibility that Carolyn's killers might have been, for obvious reasons, non-Greeks or foreigners, and that enraged them. As you might or might not know, Greece has been in the center of a lot of the immigration debates in Europe lately. Displaced individuals from countries in the Middle East or Africa make the harrowing and often deathly dangerous boat journey to one particular island in Greece named Lesbos. The government of Greece has been asking its fellow European Union members to help them with the influx of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, but the help has never really come quick enough. The presence of the asylum seekers and refugees, most of whom are escaping war-torn countries, political prosecution, and economic hardship, have bred resentment within some Greeks. It is, of course, unfair to lump all non-Greeks together the same way it is dangerous to brand all Greeks xenophobic. However, it is undeniable that some serious issues exist, such as refugees being stuck for months and years in camps that are barely fit for human living, and at the same time feeling the xenophobia and racism on top of the trauma from being displaced. For all these reasons, when Bobby's recounted how his family was burgled and how his wife was killed by foreigners, it was so easy to capture the attention of Greeks, whether they had negative opinions about refugees or foreigners in general. That subject alone was polarizing enough and spelled guaranteed readers, viewers, and listeners for the Greek and international press. I can only assume that perhaps a small part of the Greek populace may have felt emboldened to act out their racism and xenophobia given what had happened to Carolyn, but unfortunately for them, this emboldening would not last long. Now, before I proceed, I do want to focus on Carolyn for a little bit. Carolyn Crouch was born to her father, David, who is originally from Liverpool in England. Carolyn has Filipino heritage by way of her mother, Susan de la Cuesta. When she was 8 years old, the family moved to Greece, to the island of Alonisos. Carolyn was a beautiful young woman, but it is not wise to underestimate her because of her looks. Carolyn had a good head on her shoulders. After high school, she went on to study statistics. Whilst still studying, and as fate would have it, a 20-year-old Carolyn met Greek pilot and flight instructor Babis Anagnostopoulos, who was 13 years her senior. The two got on well, and next thing you know, they became a couple and then husband and wife. The couple settled down in Glicanera instead of Alonisos. Not long after they got married, Carolyn became pregnant. The family bliss seemed perfect. 9 months later, the couple welcomed baby girl Lydia. To complete this picture-perfect family life, the family also got themselves a cute puppy and named her Roxy. It therefore seemed inconceivable that in the blink of an eye, this young family was destroyed in a matter of an hour or so that May morning in 2021. Of course, Carolyn's family was devastated. Carolyn's mom and dad had to go through the painful process of dealing with the aftermath of Carolyn's death. Her family saw to it that her funeral took place at the Agia Paraskevi Church on the island of Alonisos after Carolyn's remains were flown back to the island. The funeral took place on the 14th of May. The shops on Alonisos closed as a sign of respect to the Crouches. Carolyn's coffin was covered in white roses, and baby Lydia, with the help of her father, placed flowers on her mom's coffin before the burial. The Crouch family was visibly in agony, having to say goodbye to their daughter who had so much to live for. But on top of the grief and sadness, the family also had to deal with the fact that the perpetrators of this horrible crime were still at large. Nevertheless, on that sunny day on Alonisos, the family only wanted to shut out the world and make sure that Caroline, a daughter, sister, young mother, and wife, was laid to rest on a hilltop cemetery. Whilst the family was grieving, the police in Athens continued their investigations. They obviously were hell-bent on finding out who the alleged non-Greeks were, who, according to Babis Anagnostopoulos, burgled their house and killed his wife. The police also interviewed Babis 3 more times since Carolyn's death to make sure that they were not missing anything. By Sunday, the 15th of May, merely 4 days after Carolyn's death, the police arrested a Georgian national on suspicion of being involved in the crime that took place in the Crouch Anagnostopoulos home. The man from Georgia, the country and not the American state by the way, was caught fleeing the country with a fake passport. By the next day, the police were not so sure anymore about the Georgian man. It is likely that the police, who were eager to make an arrest sooner rather than later, were driven by the pressure put on them by the public and Carolyn's family. When a case receives that much publicity, police authorities, I feel, are always pressured into delivering results that can prove rather immature. This can go either very wrong with a person being falsely accused, or it can go very right in which the police luckily arrest the right person quite early on in the investigation. Now, around the same time, the media, who was hard at work in digging up for anything report-worthy on the ongoing case, got hold of some parts of Babis' statement to the police after a document was leaked. The media and the public would learn that, according to Babis, during the burglary, he was bound with a piece of rope in a way that made him stay in a fetal position. The burglars, according to him, tightly strapped his neck with duct tape. They then apparently covered his mouth and parts of his nose. He also said that he was able to catch a glimpse of the man who leapt onto his bed where he was sleeping downstairs when the robbery and murder of Carolyn took place. Whilst the media was busy publishing these details from Babis' initial police interview, the medical examiner allocated to the autopsy of Carolyn's remains was able to publish their initial findings as well. According to this autopsy report, Carolyn attempted to resist the assault on her, but she was gagged and then strangled. Whoever strangled her used her own pair of trousers to do so. The public later learned that Carolyn was an avid kickboxer who had skills to defend herself and to inflict injury on her assailants. She likely fought hard to do just that, but was ultimately and sadly overpowered. The case kept the public's attention on their TV and phone screens, and even other public authorities had gotten involved. A reward of 300,000 euros was offered courtesy of said public authorities. Anyone with information about Carolyn's death would be handsomely rewarded because I can only presume the police were not having much luck when it came to leads. I can only imagine that the police were at that point thinking that maybe they should not be looking outside for non-Greek men, but should focus more on what was going on in Carolyn's life, especially when details about her relationship with her husband were slowly coming to light. The police were made aware in the course of their investigation that Carolyn, before her death, was seeing a psychologist. This psychologist had intimate knowledge of Carolyn's life, and that included knowing where the family hid their cash at home. The police were probably suspicious of the psychologist, who could have easily masterminded a burglary, knowing the things they knew. I can only presume that the idea was quickly shut down due to the lack of supporting evidence, but what did capture the attention of the police was the fact that Carolyn was also getting support and treatment for postnatal depression. Even Babis was getting treatment for something that the police could not ascertain at that point or were not allowed to know due to confidentiality issues. A closer look into the relationship between the couple, showed the police that the couple had ongoing marital problems. Eventually, the media reported that the marital problems went beyond the usual tiffs between husband and wife. The reports referred to possible domestic violence incidents perpetrated by Bobby's on Carolyn. Not long after these reports, excerpts of Carolyn's diary were leaked and showed that they had a stormy relationship. They showed that she was a young wife with a desire to leave her husband and was only held back by her immense love for him. It showed a young woman who wanted to be a mom and who thought that leaving her husband would mean her child does not get to grow up with a father. It sounded very much like Carolyn was torn by these two possible paths in her married life. Of course, the police were paying attention to what was being said in the media about the real status of the couple's married life, but they still continued their work in identifying the burglars. They invited Babis to look at mugshots of potential suspects, but this did not seem to have resulted in anything substantial. Meanwhile, the forensic unit that collected trace and DNA evidence on the day of the crime were hopeful that they were going to find a match in their database. But this hope was quickly extinguished after the police and the forensic unit realized that the potentially most useful DNA sample found under Carolyn's fingernails were rather poor in terms of viability testing. It would seem that the police were running out of evidence to examine, especially after they had a quick look into the CCTV footage from around the house. The police found nothing useful in the footage as the cameras were either not working or did not have their memory cards. There was a theory that maybe the burglars had removed the memory cards after they had killed Carolyn or before they started their home invasion. At this point, the police already had some thoughts about how well organized this gang of burglars must have been. They obviously thought of everything, covering their tracks and seemingly having committed the perfect crime. But here's the thing. This was the impression the police seemed to have given the public because, as it turned out, they were doing so much more in the background and examining other pieces of evidence, details of which were not made public until much, much later. As a result, over a month after Carolyn's death on the 18th of June, the Greek police announced that they had made an arrest. They arrested Babis Anagnastopoulos for the murder of his wife, Carolyn Crouch. Babis's arrest was a bombshell. When he was arrested, he was actually on Alonisos and had to be flown out to Athens for questioning. In the hours and days following that arrest, the media, the public, and Carolyn's family learned that Babis had confessed to killing Carolyn. Naturally, everybody had questions, and this was the police's time to shine. The police explained that their investigation led to one small item that provided them with what I would say is a small but very important break. They got hold of Carolyn's smartwatch, Fitbit, which she was wearing when she died. The police analyzed the data from the smartwatch and had to admit quickly that it did not correspond with the statement that Babis had given to them the month before. After questioning Babis for 8 hours after his arrest, the police put together the following version of events based on Babis's confession and other evidence they had gathered. On the 11th of May 2021, at approximately midnight, Babis was sitting on the couch and cradling baby Lydia whilst also ferociously typing on his mobile phone. He was, as it turned out, exchanging angry messages with Carolyn, who was in the attic, with one calling the other stupid. The police knew about this because they saw this happening on footage recovered from the memory cards that were initially thought to be gone. By 1:20 a.m., Babis was seen approaching the camera in the living room. This was when he removed the memory card of said camera. At this point in the case, the police most probably had to rely on Babis's confession as the camera was not working anyway. The police learned that the couple continued to argue for another 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was around this time as well that the police started putting together the timeline provided by the data from Carolyn's smartwatch. They saw that at 4:01 a.m., her smartwatch recorded an intense pulse stimulation. Babis admitted that it was around this time that he began attacking his wife in her sleep in front of their daughter, Lydia. Carolyn struggled and fought for her life for around 10 minutes, and at 4:11 a.m., the smartwatch recorded how her heart stopped beating. Carolyn was dead. Babis also revealed in his confession that he then placed their daughter next to her now deceased mother to create a more convincing crime scene. The police soon realized that Carolyn had died at least 2 hours before the time Babis suggested she must have died. These couple of hours allowed him time to stage the so-called burglary by throwing clothes and ransacking the house. The police later explained that in addition to analyzing the smartwatch and the camera in the family home, they also managed to track Babis's movements via his mobile phone. The data obtained from this line of inquiry showed many discrepancies in Babis's story. For example, the activity tracker on his phone showed him moving around the house when he was supposed to be tied up in a fetal position by, his imaginary burglars. Upon learning about this, the police grew even more confident in their belief that Babis was not only lying in his first account to the police, but could be the one who actually had murdered Carolyn. For 4 weeks, I think Babis Anagnostopoulos really thought he got away with it. He played the part of the grieving husband so well. You see, 5 days after he killed Carolyn, he had, for lack of a better word, the audacity to post an Instagram photo of their wedding, including the caption, quote, "Always together, farewell my love," end of quote. To add even more insult to injury, Babis had quite audaciously asked Carolyn's family for money to cover some, if not most, of the funeral costs. Now, this might feel normal if this had been any other type of death, but knowing what we know now, it seemed like an insult, and it was slightly psychopathic of Babis to do this to his in-laws. Now, I know what you're thinking. What was the reason Carolyn had to die? Before we get to that, I think we need to understand that even people who were friends or acquainted with Carolyn and Babis knew that their marriage was going through a rough patch. Not every couple, however, ends up being involved in a murder. So, what was Babis's motive? According to him, his wife told him that she was planning to leave him and that she was taking baby Lydia with her. He then said that he, quote-unquote, blurred out as if he lost control of himself. He then said that in that state, he killed Carolyn. He also confessed to strangling Roxy the puppy to make his staged robbery more believable. He confessed saying the following, quote, "That night we had been fighting since early in the day. At one point, she threw the baby into its bassinet and told me to get up and leave the house. She pushed me and punched me. I blurred and suffocated her, and then I staged the crime scene." End of quote. Carolyn's death opened up a dialogue about domestic violence in Greece, especially because statistics showed at that time and still shows now that there has been quite an increase of it. For the Greek at that time of Carolyn's murder, however, I do not think they expected that this would become their own Me Too movement. Sure, the brutality of what had happened to Carolyn shocked the Greek public and specifically angered the women of Greece, but now they all had to admit that intimate partner violence was a problem in their society. Stemming from that problem, there were and are concerns about femicide, or if we want to be specific, uxoricide. This rather unknown term simply means the killing of one's own wife, which I think can be seen as a subcategorization of femicide. Researchers who have made their work available on the internet look not only at the psychological reasons for such a heinous act, but also at how this act creates a ripple effect that first and foremost affects the couple's child or children. These were difficult conversations in Greece at that time, especially as other women have come forward about their plight with regards to domestic violence. For example, Olympic gold medalist Sofia Becaturo accused her former coach of assault, and this opened the floodgates for a string of accusations against some of the country's leading male celebrities. On top of the conversations about women and domestic violence, Carolyn's case also forced the Greek public to see the issues surrounding xenophobia and prejudice against non-Greeks. The fact that Babis was so quick and easy and confident in blaming the murder of Carolyn on foreigners, knowing that he would likely be believed, just shows the gravity of xenophobia in Greece. He knew what he was doing when he said all this. He knew that he was stoking the fire. Furthermore, a Georgian TV channel reported that the Georgian suspect who was previously arrested complained how he was tortured by the Greek police who forced him to confess to Carolyn's murder. Naturally, the Greek police rejected all accusations of torture and coercion. Additionally, the communities of Georgians in Greece requested an apology from police and government authorities as well as the press for libel and slander against foreigners who were presented as violent criminals. Of course, this apology was never given. Babis Anagnostopoulos, following his arrest and confession, needed a solid legal team and a defense. His legal team's strategy was to argue that whatever the sentence would be after the trial, it should reflect the fact that Babis did not plan the murder, as in it was not premeditated but merely a crime of passion. His lawyers were hoping that this would become some sort of mitigating factor. To hopefully help his case, Babis requested an expert examination of the surveillance camera at the couple's home to establish when the memory card was removed, in a bid to prove the crime occurred in a fit of rage and not after meticulous planning. He also requested to have his friends and family brought in as witnesses for a greater understanding of his relationship with Carolyn. You see, Babis described how happy their life was before problems began shortly after they wed in 2019 when Carolyn suffered a miscarriage. Bizarrely and very much in poor taste, Babis somehow blamed his wife for what had happened to her. He said that her behavior changed, that she became aggressive towards him by punching and kicking him. He said he suggested for both of them to get counseling, but Carolyn was finding excuses not to go and then eventually stopped. Towards the end of June 2021, Babis was charged with 2 offenses: intentional homicide and killing of an animal, as well as 2 misdemeanors, repeated false testimony and false report to the authorities. Just as a sidebar here, despite strong indicators that Babis may have been previously violent towards Carolyn and baby Lydia, he was not charged with any offense that would reflect domestic violence within the family. This is odd to me because the prosecutor in the separate custody process justified baby Lydia's removal from him on the basis of domestic violence occurring within the family. Now, back when I was recording this episode for my old Patreon, it was my understanding that Bobby's had had an opportunity to already speak in court for 5 hours, which gave me the impression that the trial was well underway already back in mid-2021. However, recent developments in this case lead me to believe now that what had happened in June 2021 was something entirely different and probably some sort of pre-trial process. Honestly, I'm still unclear about it. Now, I will get to the most recent developments in this case in just a minute. All that you need to know about June 2021 is that Bobby's was given an opportunity to speak, and the attending journalists later described his demeanor in court as being expressionless. Now, it is my understanding during my recording of this episode for Patreon back then that if convicted of murder, Bobby's could face up to 15 years in jail. However, if he could convince the jury and the judge that the crime was not premeditated, he could be given a much shorter 5-year prison sentence. So, what has happened since 2021? News outlets broke the news that on the 11th of May 2022, Bobby's Anagnostopoulos gave evidence for 10 hours in court, recounting in detail what had happened on the 11th of May 2021 and what his reasons were for his actions. The details I have already shared here in this episode were the same details he gave in court, with a few added things here and there. We learn that he seemed to have gone through a psychological evaluation. In court, the judge reiterated for the record that the psychologist who assessed Bobby's described him as a narcissistic and controlling person. We also learn a few more things about Bobby's reasons for quote-unquote blacking out. Bobby's said that he was mad at Carolyn for refusing to apologize for her part in the argument they had been having for the whole day that day, and for allegedly threatening to hit their daughter. All this was on top of his anger because Carolyn demanded for him to leave their house, pushing and punching him in the process. Of course, this was his version of events, and no one else could corroborate, nor were these valid reasons for him to murder his own wife. Not that there is any valid reason at all for murder. Bobby's then described exactly how he killed Carolyn. Carolyn was lying down, still fast asleep, when he got on top of her. He said he did this in order to avoid any of her attempts to hit him with her hands. He told her to calm down. She fought, shouted, and swore at him, asking him to get up and go away. Bobby's then admitted to taking his pillow and pushing it over Carolyn's face, thereby suffocating her. As before, he admitted to killing her but denied that it was murder, as it was not premeditated. When the judge in this case asked him how love could so suddenly transform into violence and hate, Bobby's said the following in Greek but was translated here for ease. Quote, "I had no purpose. There was no logic in my blurred mind at that moment. And when I saw her in profile and understood she was dead from her eyes, which were open, and her pulse, I lost it. I began to weep and pull my hair and go back and forth across the room. From the day I lost Carolyn, I lost everything. I lost my life." End of quote. 5 days after this particular hearing, on the 16th of May 2022, Bobby's Anagnostopoulos was found guilty for murder. The 7-member mixed tribunal of judges and jurors concluded unanimously that he was culpable of premeditated murder, of deliberately killing the family dog, and of perverting the course of justice. The tribunal also ruled that Bobby's should receive the toughest penalty possible, a life sentence supplemented by a further jail term of 11 years and 6 months for the brutal killing of the dog and for lying to authorities to pervert justice. A fine of 21,000 euros was also imposed. At the request of Babis's lawyer, the tribunal granted the parties a recess to consider if mitigating factors such as the good behavior he has displayed in pre-trial detention in the high-security Corridalos prison should be considered. This application was eventually rejected. Babis Anagnostopoulos was remanded back to Corridalos prison. After the sentencing, Carolyn's father said he would make sure Babis would never see baby Lydia. He stated, quote, "Now that his fate is settled, Susan and I can move on. I intend to change Lydia's name to that of her mother so that she will never be associated with this odious creature." End of quote. Baby Lydia, after her father was arrested, was temporarily given to her maternal grandparents. This temporary custody has since been made permanent. Now, before I end this episode, I want to point out a few things. The media plays such a powerful part in our lives. In cases of femicide or uxoricide, some media players have not quite understood that they carry a heavy responsibility in influencing public discourse on domestic or sexual violence. Instead of doing their due diligence, they choose to sometimes victim blame. When the case was first reported, some women's rights advocates have observed that the coverage of the media was very much favorable of Babis. They highlighted that he was a good-looking Greek guy with a lucrative career as a helicopter pilot who trained in the UK and serviced some of Greece's VIPs. Women's rights advocates also highlighted the fact that Babis was well-connected and rich, whilst Carolyn comes from a British Filipino background, something that has been the subject of the undercurrent of xenophobic discussions around this case. Mind you, Carolyn's family was said to be well off as well, as her father used to be an oil executive, but that did not matter as Carolyn was not Greek. One journalist who commented on this case said the following, quote, "They should be thankful he did not chop her up and hid her parts." End of quote. Saying something like this is beyond insensitive or cruel and makes me question the ethics of whoever this journalist was. The media, therefore, needs to be held accountable, especially in watershed moments like this. Whilst justice was served in Carolyn's case, so many others did not and will never see justice served in their cases. The media should be reporting about those cases as well, and should be reporting them in a way that would not discourage other victims and survivors of domestic abuse from coming forward in the future. Victim blaming just leads to a culture of silencing that will not only lead to more assaults on women, but also to more deaths. After all, in 2021, the same year Carolyn was murdered, 17 other women in Greece were killed by their partners. If nothing changes, the discourse that started after Carolyn's death will be all for nothing. Lagim fam, thank you so much for listening to this episode. What started out as a re-recording actually ended up in a major rewrite as well. I mistakenly said in my original audio for Patreon that the crime took place on the island of Alonisos when it really took place in Athens. It was in Alonisos that Carolyn was eventually laid to rest, as I already mentioned in the episode. Such little mistakes and other minor corrections had to be made, and what was originally a 9-page script turned into 16 pages, but all is good. If you found this case interesting and valuable, please consider supporting me by becoming a patron on my Patreon. For only $2 a month, you will get ad-free early access to my regular episodes. If you do not want to subscribe for now, you can also make a one-off or multiple donations to my buymecoffee.com page. Links to both platforms are in the show notes. You can also support me by following me on social media, by rating and reviewing my content on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts. Those things truly help spread the word about Lagim. As always, thank you so much for listening, and remember that I will be on a short break after this episode is released. I will be back with a new episode on the 15th of July. Thank you again, Lagim fam. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.